The Norfolk bus stop at 5:51 a.m. smelled like diesel exhaust and wet asphalt, the kind of morning where the world hadn't decided if it wanted to rain yet. Katie Morrison stood with her cardboard bus transfer clutched between two fingers, watching the luxury sedans sweep past without slowing. Each one carried a Mercy General nurse in pressed scrubs that didn't have frayed sleeves. Each one had a reserved parking spot waiting. She had the bus stop and the walk from the transfer station that would take her to the clinic by 6:30 if the schedule held, which it always did. Her thrift store scrubs had come from a value village outside of Virginia Beach, $3 for the set, and the fabric had started separating at the left shoulder seam sometime in the third week. She hadn't bothered fixing it. He didn't see what Katie Morrison was capable of. That was the first mistake Dr. Sterling made. When she arrived at Mercy General, the clinic was still dark except for the prep room where the morning light came in horizontal and cold. Katie moved through the space like someone reading a map only she could see. She identified the 3 suture packs that had been restocked incorrectly by the surgical supplier, wrong gauge needles, the kind mistake that wouldn't matter until it did. She replaced the 4 saline that had been sitting in direct sunlight, its sterility compromised by the heat. She noted the patient chart on the 3rd examination room where the insurance billing code listed a consultation visit but the actual procedure notes indicated a minor surgical intervention, a discrepancy that made her jaw tighten. She didn't report it. Not yet. Not when she was supposed to be invisible. The other nurses arrived at 6:15, the ones with the luxury sedans and the reserved spots. They moved through Mercy General like they owned it, their voices carrying that specific tone of people who had never been told no by someone with authority. They didn't acknowledge Katie beyond the minimum courtesy required by law. One of them, a nurse named Celeste who drove a Range Rover and wore diamond studs that caught the fluorescent lights, actually wrinkled her nose at the smell of the break room coffee that Katie had just brewed. The good kind. Dark roast. Not the swill the clinic usually stocked. "Did you make this?" Celeste asked, holding the pot like it might bite. "Yes," Katie said. She was prepping insulin syringes on the counter, her movements efficient and precise. Her hands moved through the preparation sequence without her conscious attention directing them, muscle memory. Hands that had drawn blood in desert tents at 3 in the morning. Hands that had held pressure on wounds that shouldn't have survived. Hands that now prepared insulin for diabetic patients in a private clinic in Norfolk, Virginia, which was as close to normal as a senior chief petty officer could come when her records had been scrubbed so clean that Katie Morrison barely existed in any database outside of San Gin. "It's very strong," Celeste said, which was not a compliment. Katie didn't respond. She finished with the syringes and moved them to the medication refrigerator, each one labeled in her precise handwriting. The label maker that the clinic had purchased cost $400. Katie had learned to handwrite her labels in the field, where equipment malfunctioned and you adapted or you died. Neither of those skills was relevant anymore. Or so everyone was supposed to believe. Dr. Sterling arrived at exactly 7:15 a.m., his Italian leather shoes announcing him down the corridor before his body did. He was a tall man with the kind of face that had been handsome in his 30s and had held on to the architecture of that handsomeness even as he'd entered his 50s. His watch cost more than Katie's monthly salary, a Rolex Submariner, the kind that worked at depth. He'd never been to depth. He'd never been anywhere that required the kind of watch that announced its cost in the way that Rolex did. But he wore it anyway, the way he wore everything, as a statement about who he was and who everyone else wasn't. The first patient that morning was a woman in her 70s with 3 failed blood draws from her regular nurse, the skin around her veins bruised purple and green. She was frightened. Katie could see it in the way her hands trembled when she held out her arm, in the way her breathing had become shallow. Dr. Sterling had already moved past the examination room by the time Katie intercepted the situation. She asked the woman her name, spoke about the weather in Norfolk, mentioned that she'd had similar difficulties before and that it usually got better on the second attempt. The woman's name was Margaret. She had grandchildren. Her garden was struggling because of the late frost. Katie found the vein on the dorsal surface of Margaret's hand on the first attempt, the needle sliding in without resistance, blood flowing immediately into the tube with the smooth dark color of a successful puncture. Margaret's shoulders dropped. She thanked Katie 3 times. Dr. Sterling, standing in the doorway, watched the entire procedure with an expression that didn't change. But something behind his eyes did. It flickered like a light switch being thrown, recognition meeting calculation, and Katie felt the specific cold that came from being noticed by someone dangerous. That was the second mistake Dr. Sterling made, showing Katie that he'd recognized what she was. Most people went through life without being truly seen. Katie had spent 18 years in an organization where being seen correctly was the difference between coming home and not. She recognized the look of a predator identifying potential prey, and she recognized the moment he began planning. The clinic where Dr. Sterling ran his operation moved with precision, the kind of precision that came from someone protecting something valuable. The scheduling was military grade. The patient flow was optimized. The staff rotation seemed random but actually wasn't, Katie noticed, if you paid attention. And she always paid attention. The insurance coding that Dr. Sterling used was interesting. The billing codes didn't always match the actual procedures performed. A consultation appointment would be billed as a surgical intervention. A minor suture job would be billed as a complex wound closure with specialist fees included. The patterns were consistent. The discrepancies were deliberate. The money being generated was significantly higher than the actual services provided. Katie noticed all of this because noticing things was what she'd been trained to do, and you didn't forget training like that. She kept her observations quiet. She kept her head down. She wore the thrift store scrubs with the frayed sleeve and the bruised knuckles that came from 6 months of scrubbing medical instruments with slightly too much pressure. She carried a cracked navy mug in her locker, the kind of mug that no longer matched anything in her life, because it was from a unit that officially never existed. She kept a dying succulent on the break room windowsill, and she watered it every morning before anyone else arrived, because keeping something alive required attention and precision. She kept a photograph in her badge holder, a unit photo from Sanjin, from before the operation that had been classified so thoroughly that the Pentagon's own records had been revised to exclude her name. Half the faces in that photograph were crossed out in her mind. The other half she didn't let herself think about at all. The faded unit patch was sewn inside her jacket lining, hidden against her ribs where Sanjin still lived in scar tissue that had become so much a part of her body that she sometimes forgot the person she'd been before the wounds. The patch was visible only if you knew to look for it, only if you understood what unit insignia meant, only if you'd worn the same patch yourself. It was cotton. It was small. It was the only thing that proved Katie Morrison had ever been anyone other than the nurse with the thrift store scrubs and the cardboard bus transfer. By the end of the first week, Dr. Sterling had established the pattern. He watched her work. He saw the efficiency. He saw the confidence that came from someone who'd done critical thinking under pressure, who'd made decisions with lives hanging in the balance. And that was when the danger started to shift in the room, because a man like Dr. Sterling didn't tolerate threats. He eliminated them. Or he tried to. Katie had been operating in fields of actual danger for long enough to recognize the moment when someone decided you were a problem. She'd been through combat. This was something else. This was institutional. This was someone with power and a network. This was someone who could make a phone call and destroy your life if you gave him a reason to think you were worth destroying. What he didn't know was that Katie Morrison wasn't actually on his payroll as the person he thought she was. What he didn't know was that her records had been scrubbed by people with far more power than his network held. What he didn't know was that Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, holder of a Navy Cross and 2 Silver Stars, had been trained to survive exactly this kind of situation. But that knowledge, that history, that entire version of herself, was buried so deep that not even the FBI was supposed to know she existed. She was supposed to be invisible. She was supposed to stay that way. She was supposed to disappear into this clinic, do the work, and vanish quietly when her obligated service was complete. Dr. Sterling had other ideas about what invisibility meant, and by the start of the second week, the calculation in his eyes had transformed into something more dangerous, a plan. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Katie could feel it coming, like the pressure change before a storm, and she had no authority to do anything about it except wait for him to make his first move. So she showed up at 5:19 a.m. to the bus stop on Norfolk's eastern side, and she held her cardboard transfer, and she let the luxury sedans pass without slowing, and she prepared herself for whatever Dr. Sterling was going to do next, because she'd learned a long time ago that sometimes survival meant letting the danger come to you first. Dr. Sterling gathered the nursing staff in the break room on Katie's third day, his smile sharp as surgical steel. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in a fluorescent tomb. "I'm making a wager, ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who'd never been told no. "Our charity case hire here, let's call her Bus Stop Betty, won't last the week. Any takers?" The laughter came in waves. One of the nurses from the day shift actually slapped her knee. Another whispered something to her colleague that made them both look at Katie and grin. Sterling counted out $50 bills on the counter with the deliberate slowness of a man performing for an audience. His fingers were manicured, nails buffed to a shine that Katie recognized as the kind of grooming that required a standing appointment at some place with Italian leather chairs. "Come on. Who's betting she quits by Friday?" Katie stood at the back of the break room, her hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of coffee so thin the liquid inside barely steamed. She took one measured breath. The kind of breath taught in combat medicine training, the kind that steadied a heartbeat when the world was collapsing. A single tear escaped down her cheek before she wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her face absolutely still, her jaw clenched but her expression empty of anything Dr. Sterling could use against her. She said nothing. The silence in the break room stretched like taffy being pulled. One of the younger nurses, fresh out of her nursing program, probably 23, looked uncomfortable. But Sterling only widened his smile, pleased with her non-response, interpreting her silence as weakness instead of what it actually was, a combat-trained operative measuring a threat. "That's what I thought," Sterling said, turning back to the other nurses. $50 says she's gone by Friday. Who wants in?" 3 hands went up immediately. Katie walked out of the break room and returned to her station. The medication cart needed restocking, and the afternoon chart reviews were sitting on her desk like an accusation. She moved through the clinic the way she'd been trained to move through hostile territory, present but invisible, competent but unobtrusive, noticing everything while appearing to notice nothing. She saw the way Dr. Sterling moved through patient rooms with the casual authority of a man who'd never questioned his own dominance. She saw the billing codes on the charts he left behind, the insurance claims that bore only a passing resemblance to the actual procedures documented in the patient notes. She saw patterns that screamed fraud the way a tripwire screamed danger. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling was beginning to see her too. The cafeteria incident came 2 days later, on a Friday that should have felt like vindication. Katie was still employed, her week not yet finished. The lunchroom was crowded with the mid-shift changeover, that chaotic moment when incoming nurses crossed paths with those heading out. Katie balanced her lunch tray, Tuesday's discounted sandwich and a bottle of water from the vending machine, as she navigated toward an empty table in the corner. The sandwich was 3 days old, marked down 40%, and tasted like cardboard that had been rained on and then dried in a dryer. She'd eaten worse things downrange. She'd eaten things that weren't technically food. Dr. Sterling was laughing with 2 of the orthopedic residents when his elbow caught the corner of her tray with what might have been accidental but felt like calculation. The tray went airborne. The sandwich tumbled. The plastic water bottle hit the floor and bounced twice before exploding in a spray. But it was the pasta salad, the one thing she'd brought from home, prepared at 5 in the morning to save money, that hit the tile floor with the sound of something dying. Marinara sauce spread across the white tiles like arterial spray. The room went silent except for one nurse's poorly suppressed giggle that exploded into open laughter when she realized no one was stopping her. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," Sterling said, though his eyes were dancing with amusement and something sharper, something that looked like curiosity about how far he could push before she broke. "How clumsy of me." Katie knelt slowly on the tile floor. Her scrubs had gone from clean to sore-stained in the space of 3 seconds. Someone had brought paper towels, not Sterling, one of the nicer nurses from pediatrics, and Katie began methodically gathering the remains of her lunch. The soggy bread. The plastic utensils. The shattered Tupperware container. Sterling's shadow fell across her as she worked, his shoes perfectly polished, probably Italian leather, probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget. Clumsy, bus stop. Maybe coordination isn't your strong suit, he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it, loud enough that everyone else could too. Should I be worried about patient safety? Given your previous employment, gaps. Katie looked up from the floor, her hands perfectly steady, that same measured breath moving through her lungs. Another tear tracked down her cheek, not from sadness, not from shame, but from the sheer physical effort of maintaining composure when every fiber of her body was coded for violence. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, leaving a faint smear of marinara. I've picked up pieces of better men than you'll ever be, she said. Her voice was steady as a held rifle, flat and matter-of-fact, the kind of voice that made Sterling actually take a step back. They died in Sanjin. In valleys whose names don't appear on any map anymore. And they were twice the man you'll ever be on your best day. The cafeteria went absolutely silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence where you can hear the ventilation system humming, the fluorescent lights buzzing their electronic hymn, the distant sound of a monitor alarm in one of the patient rooms. Katie finished cleaning without another word. She stood, deposited the ruined lunch into the trash bin, and walked out of the cafeteria with her shoulders back and her head level. Behind her, Dr. Sterling's face had gone the color of old paper. The other nurses suddenly became very interested in their phones. The chart throwing happened the following Monday during morning rounds, when the surgical team was reviewing the previous week's cases. Katie had spent the entire weekend in her studio apartment, 300 square feet, rent paid by a VA benefit she'd requested be processed through a civilian address, going through medical records. The discrepancies had started small. A billing code for a complex bowel resection that didn't match the documented appendectomy. An insurance claim for exploratory laparoscopy on a patient who'd never been prepped for anything but a simple hernia repair. Patterns. Numbers that didn't align with reality. She'd brought the patient files to morning rounds and stood at the periphery of the group while Dr. Sterling presented cases with the confidence of a man who'd never been questioned. When he finished with the appendectomy patient, the Army Ranger who'd mentioned Sanjin, whose eyes were still flickering between heavy medication and half-consciousness in the recovery room, Katie stepped forward. Doctor, there's a discrepancy on the RBC for billing code. The chart documents appendectomy with uncomplicated closure. The insurance claim shows extensive bowel resection. The room temperature dropped. Dr. Sterling's face went tight, the muscles in his jaw clenching visible beneath his skin. He didn't say anything for 3 seconds. He just stared at Katie with the intensity of a man recalculating every move he'd made in the past week. Then he turned, gathered his patient files from the counter, and hurled them at her feet. Papers scattered across the hallway like confetti after a parade. A few landed in the waste bin. Others fluttered and settled against the baseboards. Pick that up, sweetheart, Sterling said, his voice like honey poured over broken glass. And while you're down there, remember that questioning my medical decisions is about 3 pay grades above your authority. In fact, it's so far above your authority that if you ever do it again in front of staff, I'll have you escorted out by security before you can finish the sentence. Are we clear? Katie gathered each sheet methodically. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song above her. Other nurses walked past, eyes carefully averted, because witnessing could make you complicit and complicity was something nobody wanted hanging around their necks. Katie's hands didn't shake. Her breathing stayed even. When she stood, holding the reorganized files, she met Sterling's eyes and said, "Yes, doctor," in a tone that somehow made it sound like a threat. Like a warning. Like the moment of calm before something catastrophic happened. Sterling's smile faltered. For the first time, Katie watched genuine uncertainty flicker across his face, not fear exactly, but something close to it. The look of a man who'd just realized he'd miscalculated the weight of what he was carrying. She held his gaze for 3 more seconds, then turned and walked back to her station, leaving him standing in the hallway surrounded by scattered papers. That evening, Sterling made phone calls. 3 of them, to board members, each one planting seeds in fertile ground. Concerning background inconsistencies. Possible credential irregularities. A reference check that didn't quite line up. The mechanism of destruction set in motion because some men can't tolerate the presence of someone who doesn't break when they're supposed to break. Wednesday morning arrived like every other morning, except it didn't. The appendectomy was routine. A man in his early 40s, home on medical leave from Fort Benning, classified file redacted so thoroughly that Katie could only see his name and his rank. Captain. That was enough. She'd learned to read the gaps in military files the way other people read resumes. No deployment listed. No unit affiliation. No dates. Just 18 months of official nothing, the kind of nothing that meant Sanjin or Kandahar or a place that didn't officially exist. He was prepped and waiting when she arrived for the post-op dressing change on Wednesday afternoon, his morphine drip running clear and steady, his breathing easy under the oxygen cannula delivering 2 liters per minute. She moved through the routine with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this 10,000 times: vitals check, incision inspection, saline irrigation, fresh dressing. The sutures were textbook clean, the surgical site healing without signs of infection. Dr. Sterling had actually done competent work for once, though Katie suspected that was less about medical excellence and more about the captain's rank triggering some vestigial respect Sterling still clung to. She was closing the fresh dressing when the captain's eyes opened. Not the lazy flutter of someone waking from anesthesia. The sudden alert opening of a man's eyes who recognizes something. His pupils dilated despite the morphine coursing through his veins, his hand moved slightly toward hers, and when he spoke his voice was rough with medication but sharp with recognition. "That's a Sanjin stitch," he whispered. Katie's hands went still. The dressing tape hung suspended between her fingers and the captain's chest. She didn't breathe. She didn't move. She didn't break eye contact. Nobody outside the 160th SOR Operations Network knew how to tie a Sanjin stitch. It wasn't taught in nursing schools. It wasn't in any civilian medical textbook. It was a field technique developed over 2 decades of high-altitude mountain operations, a specific pattern of suturing that distributed pressure differently than standard surgical closure, designed for wounds that needed to hold under conditions, running, diving, being thrown against rocks, that peacetime surgeons never accounted for. The stitch had a name because the men who learned it were scattered across Sanjin Valley in Helmand Province, because they developed it in the middle of gunfire while trying to keep each other alive. The captain was staring at her with the kind of recognition that happened when 2 people from the same war found each other in a place that was supposed to be safe. His hand reached further, trying to grip her wrist. "Reaper," he slurred through the morphine haze. "That's a Reaper stitch." Katie's jaw tightened. Just barely. A microscopic clenching that might have looked like nothing to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. She finished securing the dressing tape with steady hands, her fingers moving with the same precision they always moved with, her face displaying the same professional composure it always displayed. But her mind was running through 18 months of operations, through casualty counts, through a specific unit patch she kept sewn inside her jacket lining, the one with her call sign woven into the thread so small that only someone who knew exactly where to look would ever find it. The captain's eyes were closing again, the morphine dragging him back down, but his lips were moving. "So you, in the corridor. So your hands. Knew." His words trailed into unconsciousness, but they hung in the air like a detonated charge. Knew. He knew. Not suspected. Not wondered. Knew. Katie stepped back from the bed and exhaled slowly through her nose. Around her, the monitors beat their steady rhythm, O2 sat holding at 94%, heart rate steady at 72, blood pressure stable at 118/76. All the numbers looked fine. All the numbers were lies. She'd been invisible for 18 months. 18 months of scrubs and bus stops and sideways glances from nurses in their luxury sedans. 18 months of being a bus stop Betty, the charity case hire, the woman Sterling dismissed as barely competent enough to change dressings. 18 months of no one knowing that Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison had held the rank that meant she could make decisions in situations where decisions meant the difference between breathing and not breathing, between bringing people home and bringing flags home. And now a man with morphine in his bloodstream and recognition in his eyes had just spoken her call sign aloud in a hospital room with 4 walls that weren't thick enough to contain that kind of information. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that he'd spoken it with the voice of someone who understood exactly what she was. Not a mistake. Not an accident. He'd recognized her because he'd trained alongside her. Because he'd bled alongside her. Because he'd survived something in Sanjin that most people didn't survive, and the hands that had kept him breathing then were the same hands that had just sutured him closed now. Katie finished the dressing check, documented the vitals in the chart with her standard handwriting and her standard notes, nothing unusual, healing on schedule, patient alert and oriented, and she was turning to leave when she noticed something. The captain's left lung was moving less than his right. Not dramatically. Just slightly. A reduction in chest wall excursion on the left side that didn't quite match the expansion pattern of his right side. She paused. Tilted her head. Listened. The oxygen saturation was still reading 94, but oxygen sat was a lagging indicator. It didn't drop until the lungs had already started failing. She'd seen men with oxygen readings in the high 90s who were actually dying, the numbers just hadn't caught up yet. She reached down and palpated the captain's chest wall gently, her fingertips reading the subcutaneous tissue like braille, feeling for the subtle crackle that would indicate air escaping into the pleural space. There. A whisper of it. Subcutaneous emphysema, which meant there was air leaking somewhere, which meant the lung itself might be partially collapsed, which meant tension pneumothorax was developing exactly the way it developed in the field when you had a surgical wound near the chest cavity and your stitches decided to give way. She glanced at the monitor again. Oxygen sat had dropped to 91. The captain's respiratory rate was climbing. 52 breaths per minute. Then 54. His face was pale, his lips starting to lose their color. Katie reached for the call button without taking her eyes off the monitors. She pressed it once. Hard. And waited. The room filled with the sound of the ventilator next to the adjacent patient, the rhythmic whoosh of mechanical breathing that suddenly felt less like a medical device and more like a countdown timer. The nurse arrived in 30 seconds. Too long. Already too long. Katie's voice came out level and flat. Tension pneumothorax. Get me a 14-gauge catheter and a decompression kit. Now. The nurse's eyes widened. I'll get Dr. Sterling, now. He's desaturating. The nurse moved, and Katie was counting respirations, watching the captain's trachea for the subtle shift that would confirm what she already knew was happening. There. A deviation to the right. The collapsed lung was pushing the mediastinum aside, which meant pressure was building, which meant the captain had maybe 2 minutes before his cardiovascular system started to fail completely. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway like a curse. He took in the scene with the calculated speed of a man who'd been trained to assess, and whatever he saw in that moment made his mouth go thin. He moved toward the supply cart, but Katie was already moving too, her hands reaching for the crash cart, her fingers finding the cabinet with the decompression needles. Step back, Sterling said. Not a question. An order. His voice had the particular sharpness of a man who'd just realized that Katie knew what she was doing. Bus stop. You're not authorized for invasive procedures. Step back. Katie didn't step back. She didn't hesitate. She didn't do any of the things that a person without 18 months of suppressed military training would do. Instead, her hands moved on their own. Muscle memory took over, the kind of muscle memory that came from doing the same emergency procedure 200 times in conditions where you didn't have time to think about authorization. She grabbed the 14-gauge catheter from the crash cart. Located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark she could find in darkness, in dust storms, in the middle of chaos. And because the decompression kit wasn't immediately available, she used a ballpoint pen casing as a makeshift guide, the kind of improvisation that only made sense if you'd ever had to keep someone breathing with whatever equipment the universe happened to be offering at that moment. The needle went in with a whisper of resistance. Then the hiss. That distinctive sound of air escaping under pressure, the sound that told her everything she needed to know was in exactly the right place. She felt it more than heard it, the sudden release of pressure, the small plastic one-way valve she'd jury-rigged beginning to let air escape from the pleural space without letting it come back in. Within seconds, the captain's oxygen saturation began climbing. 92. 94. 97. His respiratory rate dropped from 54 to 42. His lips began to regain their color. His chest wall began moving symmetrically again. 4 people were standing frozen in the room, 2 nurses, an orderly, and a medical student, and they were all staring at bus stop Betty like she'd just performed surgery with a coffee spoon. Dr. Sterling was staring too, but his expression was different. He was staring at someone who'd just rendered him obsolete, who'd just demonstrated competence he couldn't dismiss or diminish, who'd just saved a captain's life with a ballpoint pen and the kind of knowledge that wasn't supposed to exist in Mercy General's clinic. Katie removed her glove slowly. Carefully. She met Sterling's eyes with the flat, empty expression of someone who'd made a choice and would make it again. He was dying, she said quietly. Now he's not. She turned and walked out of the room, and behind her she could hear Sterling already dialing his phone, his voice low and urgent as he began to activate his network, because some men cannot tolerate being rendered irrelevant, and Sterling had just understood that every reference check he'd initiated, every board member he'd called, every plan he'd set in motion would mean nothing if Katie Morrison was allowed to continue existing in his hospital. The mechanism of destruction shifted into overdrive. Within the hour, 3 board members had received calls about her dangerous overreach. By end of business, an outside medical investigator would be contracted to review the incident. And Katie still didn't know that Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison wasn't supposed to exist anymore, didn't know that her records had been scrubbed clean by people far more powerful than Sterling, didn't know that surfacing the way she'd surfaced would mean consequences that would arrive in ways she couldn't predict. But somewhere in a hospital room, sedated and healing, an Army Ranger captain was sleeping with the knowledge burning behind his closed eyes. A man who'd trained alongside her. A man who knew her call sign. A man who was already beginning to understand that he'd just been saved by a ghost, and that ghosts didn't come back from the dead without a reason. 2 days post-op, the captain's breathing pattern shifted. Katie noticed it first, respiratory rate climbing from 16 to 22, then 28. She was checking his dressing at 0300 when she felt his trachea deviate slightly left under her fingertips. Tension pneumothorax. Missed by the surgeon who specialized in billing fraud more than surgical competence. The captain's oxygen saturation read 91% and falling. His skin had taken on the gray-blue tone of a man running out of time. She moved to the monitor. Systolic pressure dropping like an elevator with cut cables, 120, 105, 98. The captain's eyes opened, confused and drowsy from morphine, his pupils blown wide from hypoxia. His left lung had collapsed. Air was filling the space between his lung and chest wall, crushing his heart, stealing his oxygen. Every breath he took made it worse. This wasn't a surgical complication anymore. This was a death sentence written in centimeters. Katie grabbed the emergency cart. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Ballpoint pen casing from the desk. Alcohol prep pad. Her hands moved like they'd been doing this every day for the past 8 years, because they had, just in a different uniform, in a different country where the screaming didn't stop. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She positioned the needle against his chest wall like she'd positioned them 1,000 times before, in supply tents and medevac helicopters and the blood-soaked dirt of Sanjin where pain was information and information was survival. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping sounded like a pressure valve finally releasing. She threaded the pen casing over the needle to act as a one-way valve. Air could escape but couldn't re-enter. Combat field medicine. Improvised. Invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 18 months learning to keep broken people alive with nothing but will and what you could carry in a rucksack. His oxygen climbed. 84%. 89. 92. The monitor showed his heart rate beginning to stabilize, the pressure wave returning to something that resembled rhythm instead of desperation. His color shifted from gray to something approaching human. Katie completed the procedure with a dressing that would hold, then stepped back and took one measured breath. 4 witnesses stood in the doorway. The night charge nurse. 2 residents. An intern who'd followed Katie into the room because something in her voice had cut through the fog of sleep deprivation. They'd watched her move with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this under fire, with incoming rounds close enough to feel the percussion. They'd seen her save a man's life with equipment that should not have worked but did, because she wasn't just a nurse. She was something else entirely, and now they knew. Dr. Sterling arrived at 0347 in pressed slacks and a polo shirt, moved with the swagger of a man who'd never had to understand that some skills can't be taught in a classroom. He saw the captain breathing normally. Saw the dressing. Saw the 4 witnesses standing frozen in the hallway. He saw everything except what he needed to, the fact that Katie Morrison had just performed an emergency needle decompression with a ballpoint pen casing while he was nowhere to be found, and that she'd done it like someone who'd been trained by the finest military medics on the planet. His phone was in his hand before the sun rose. Board members received calls at 0600 0615 and 0630. "I have serious concerns about our newest hire," Sterling said, his voice carrying the practiced worry of a man protecting something valuable. "Her credentials appear to have gaps. Unexplained employment history. And she performed an unauthorized invasive procedure last night without physician authorization. I'm worried about patient safety going forward." By 0800, a retired physician named Dr. Hammond arrived at Mercy General with a leather folder and the tired expression of someone who'd been called in early for credential review work. He interviewed the 4 witnesses. Their answers were consistent. Katie had saved the captain's life with precision and calm that suggested significant training. But Hammond's job wasn't to praise heroics. His job was to verify credentials and identify protocol violations. And there had been a violation. Unauthorized procedure. Patient endangerment despite positive outcome. Katie waited in the break room, staring at her dying succulent with hands that finally shook. Not from fear. From rage. From understanding that Sterling had anticipated this moment, had already positioned his narrative, had already made his calls. The thing about fighting an enemy with institutional power is that he doesn't need to kill you. He just needs to make you disappear. Hammond's recommendation came at 4:44 p.m., credentials suspended pending full investigation. No exceptions. No appeal timeline. Just gone. Security arrived at 5:15. The same guard who'd nodded to her each morning, now avoiding her eyes like she'd contracted something contagious. "I'm sorry. I need to escort you out." His voice was apologetic, which made it worse. He was a decent man doing what decent men do when they work in broken systems, just following orders. Katie understood that language better than anyone. She packed her belongings into a cardboard box. The cracked navy mug that said "World's Okayest Chief," a gift from a corpsman who died in Helmand Province and whose name she'd stopped saying aloud because the sound of it in her own voice made her chest collapse. The succulent she'd tried and failed to keep alive, somehow fitting. The photograph of her unit, everyone standing in formation in front of a Black Hawk, half of them already accounted for by Sangin's unforgiving mathematics. She held the photo for 3 seconds. Just 3. Then folded it and set it in the box. Dr. Sterling watched from his office doorway, his smile sharp and surgical, the expression of a man who'd just successfully removed a tumor. "Good luck finding another position, bus stop. I'll make sure your references are thorough." It wasn't a threat. It was worse, it was certainty. The confidence of someone who'd activated his network, who'd already positioned her as unstable, who'd already begun the work of making sure no hospital in Norfolk would touch her. Katie walked past him carrying the box against her chest. Her jaw tightened. Her breathing slowed. One measured breath. Just one. One tear escaped before she wiped it without breaking stride and said absolutely nothing, because she'd been ordered to disappear after Sanjin, told that Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison no longer existed in any database, and surfacing now would mean consequences she couldn't predict. Speaking would confirm everything Sterling had claimed. Staying silent was the only leverage she had left. The rain started as she reached the parking lot, fat drops that hammered against the cardboard like applause from an audience that wanted her to fail. Her box began to soften. The corners lost their structure. The cracked mug shifted inside, and she could hear it, a small hollow sound like something breaking a second time. By the time she reached the bus stop where she'd waited every morning for 3 months, the bottom was threatening to give way entirely. She sat on the wet bench surrounded by her ruined belongings while buses came and went without stopping, carrying passengers to destinations that weren't empty park benches and cardboard dissolution. Her phone buzzed at 2100, a text from an unknown number. "The captain is asking for Reaper." She deleted it and turned off the phone. Turned off the last connection she had to anything that mattered. The rain continued, and Katie Morrison stopped being anyone at all. She was just a woman on a bench with a dying plant and the photograph of ghosts, waiting for whatever came next, understanding finally that sometimes the system doesn't just destroy you. Sometimes it makes you destroy yourself by requiring you to stay silent while it happens. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that somewhere in a hospital bed, a ranger captain who'd survived Sanjin and survived surgery was now slowly waking up, looking for the woman who'd saved him, and finding nothing but the echo of her name in a mouth that no longer existed. The ranger captain's eyes snapped open at 3:56 a.m., and he knew immediately what he'd heard before the morphine dragged him under. Combat medic stitch. Nobody learned that in civilian nursing school. Nobody. His daughter had stayed the night in the visitor's chair, her army dress uniform still crisp despite the sleeping position, and she jolted awake at the sound of his fire alarm. He was already reaching for the call button, then the wheelchair, his voice cutting through the hospital quiet like a blade. "Get me mobile. Now." His daughter, Lieutenant Chen, understood the tone. She'd grown up hearing it. She helped him into the chair without argument, steadying him as he tested his weight on legs that hadn't carried him more than 20 feet in 3 weeks. "Captain," the night nurse said, moving toward him with that cautious approach people used around men who'd been broken and put back together. He waved her off. "I need to find someone." "A nurse." Call sign was Reaper. "Worked here. Dark hair. Quiet. Hands that knew what they were doing." The nurse's face shifted. Confusion, then something harder. There was a nurse like that. They let her go. Day before yesterday. The captain's jaw clenched. His daughter put a hand on his shoulder, and he closed his eyes for 3 seconds, breathing like a man clearing smoke from his lungs. "Then we find her." Morning arrived grey and heavy over Norfolk, the kind of October rain that soaked through everything and didn't apologize. The bus stop on Commerce Street was the kind of place people passed without seeing: weathered metal bench, cracked plastic shelter, a digital sign that hadn't been updated since Tuesday. Katie Morrison sat on that bench with what remained of her existence in a cardboard box that had given up. The bottom had dissolved during the night. Her cracked navy mug leaked cold coffee onto pages of her discharge paperwork. The succulent was dead. The photograph of her unit, the one half of them came home from, was wrapped in plastic, but she could still see the faces through the translucent blur. She didn't look up when the blue sedan pulled to the curb. The first voice she heard was one she recognized instantly, her daughter's voice, though Katie had never given birth, had never been allowed the architecture of normal family, had adopted the 75th Ranger Regiment as her blood instead. Lieutenant Chen stood in the rain without a cover, uniform starched despite the humidity, and her words came across the wet pavement like a salute: "My father's awake. He asked me to find the combat medic. He kept saying the name Reaper." Katie's hand stilled. The box sagged further, the last integrity of cardboard surrendering to gravity. "Lieutenant." A single word. Acknowledgement, and something that might have been a prayer. The wheelchair came around the vehicle's side, pushed by Chen, and the captain's face was still grey, but his eyes were the blue of a Hellfire missile sight, locked and tracking. He pulled something from inside his jacket lining, and the rain scattered off it like it was repelling water through sheer force of will. A unit patch. Faded. Worn. The same one Katie had sewn into her own coat 17 years ago when she was 23 years old and immortal and stupid enough to believe she'd come home the same. "This nurse is Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison," the captain said, and the words landed like a command detonation. A hospital administrator who'd been walking toward the bus shelter stopped moving entirely. 3 orderlies loading the transport van froze mid-step. The rain kept falling. Lieutenant Chen opened a file with trembling hands. Her voice was steady, but that tremor told Katie her daughter, no, not her daughter, this officer she'd never met, understood the weight of what was about to be spoken aloud. Bronze Star. She paused. Let the first silence settle. Silver Star. Another Silver Star. Navy Cross. Katie's eyes closed. The rain hammered the cardboard, and somewhere in the boxes of her shattered things, something irreplaceable was drowning. 17 confirmed saves under fire in Sanjin Valley. 3 of those saves were fellow combat medics. The next voice that came was older, scarred in ways that didn't show on skin. A Navy SEAL commander in a pressed civilian suit, who'd driven 6 hours through the night from Quantico, stood at parade rest beside the wheelchair. When he spoke, he listed decorations like he was reading from a memorial wall: Joint Service Commendation Medal, Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal, Combat Action Ribbon. With every name, the small crowd, because it was a crowd now, people emerging from the clinic, from the parking lot, from their morning routines, fell into deeper silence. The kind of silence that came when you realized you'd been standing next to a legend and treating her like she was disposable. And an expeditionary medal, the commander finished, for classified operations that this government is no longer permitted to discuss. The rain stopped. That wasn't meteorology. That was the sky respecting the weight of what had just been said. An FBI liaison arrived at 9:15 a.m., moving with the particular unhurried grace of people who didn't need to rush because institutions bent to their schedule. Agent Torres approached Katie without drama, without theater, and simply placed a folder on the bus stop bench. When she opened it, the letterhead read, "Congressional Investigation into Black Site Medical Protocols, Classified, Declassified this date." The forced disappearance of Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison was predicated on classified operations, Agent Torres said, her voice the texture of weathered canvas. Those operations are now under review by 3 separate oversight committees. The order that erased you is no longer valid. Your record has been restored. Your rank is restored. Your right to exist in every database, every system, every record is restored. Katie's hand shook. Just her hands. The rest of her held steady. The commander reached across and covered her hands with his, and they waited together until the shaking stopped. Dr. Sterling's phone rang at 3:22 p.m. The voice on the other end was the board president, and it was the voice of someone reading from a script that had already been decided. "We're going to need your resignation." By 3:41 p.m., 3 more board members had called. By 4:15 p.m., the outside investigator was being interviewed again, this time about who had hired him and why his report had been so specifically crafted to destroy a nurse's career rather than investigate her credentials. The State Medical Board opened an inquiry into 6 months of billing codes. A pattern emerged: upcoding, unnecessary procedures, kickback arrangements with a supplier whose equipment nobody actually needed. 5 separate board members resigned. The medical director who'd approved Katie's suspension was placed on administrative leave. Dr. Sterling's attorney called him at 4:56 p.m. The advice was clear: settle, cooperate, accept whatever deal was offered. But Sterling had spent 30 years building an identity based on being untouchable, and he refused until the state board suspended his license pending full investigation. Mercy General's administration terminated his contract by 4:52 p.m. They were thorough about it. At 4:56 p.m., the same security guard who'd escorted Katie out, a former Army specialist named Holloway, arrived at Sterling's office with a cardboard box. The box was identical to the one that had broken apart on that bus stop bench. Holloway met Sterling's eyes without malice, without satisfaction, just the clear weight of someone witnessing consequence. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor." Sterling packed his diplomas, his awards, his Italian leather desk set while nurses watched from doorways. His Mercedes was still in the parking lot, still immaculate. When he drove away from Mercy General, no one waved. 6 months later, Katie Morrison ran the Veterans Trauma Program at Norfolk Naval Medical Center. Her senior chief insignia was visible on her uniform sleeve. The unit patch was sewn openly now, a decoration rather than a secret. The program treated combat veterans whose physical wounds had healed but whose invisible architecture remained fractured. They needed providers who understood Sanjin and Fallujah and Kandahar not as geography but as memory. Every morning before her shift, Katie drove past the old bus stop. A homeless vet named Marcus had claimed the bench as his territory. She stopped with 2 coffees, black with cream, and they'd talk about the weather and the nationals and never about the wars that had left them both in this city. One morning, Marcus asked her why she always touched the patch on her sleeve. Katie looked at the morning commute flowing around them like water around a stone, and she said, "Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns." Marcus nodded like he'd known that all along. The captain came to the trauma center quarterly, fully recovered, to speak to veteran patients about asking for help. His daughter, now Captain Chen herself, ran outreach programs connecting military medical personnel with civilian positions. The cracked Navy mug sat on Katie's desk, holding pens instead of coffee. The photograph of her unit hung on her wall, properly framed, the faces no longer hidden. And every shift, Katie carried both names forward, the one the world had tried to erase and the one she'd earned back in the rain, one medal at a time. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you were standing next to, hit subscribe. Leave a comment and tell me about a time you saw someone show up as themselves after being forced to disappear. Because these stories matter. The quiet ones. The ones that survive in the dark. Make sure you're not missing them.